So this lecture is about the five dynasties and the Song Dynasty. And I'm not really going to differentiate between the two since this isn't just a Chinese art class. So at the end of the Tang Dynasty, we start to see the development of Chan Buddhism, which is known as Zen in Japan. And in the United States, it's known as Zen because Japanese people brought over those concepts to the United States. So there were Buddhist persecutions in the 840s, and there was a lot of reasons for that, but probably the main reason is that the bureaucracy has developed that was um, important to the functioning of the Chinese state, perhaps became too powerful. So the emperor and the imperial court decided that they wanted to get rid of them, so they did that. And we also see some more kind of ideas where the hereditary nobility is out and the bureaucrats are in. So this is a time when the civil service examinations allow people to be able to get jobs in government, and those are the people that are running the Chinese state at this time. So during the five dynasties, it was a time of civil war and strife, and what came out of it was the Song Dynasty in 960. The northern Song was established, and then on the map, we have the southern Song Empire. So in 1126, Jins from Manchuria expel the Song, and they move south. So nobility, again, they're losing power. The merchant class, the people that are selling, they get more power. By this time, there's 4 cities with more than 1 million in population, which is probably at least 3 more than any other polity in the entire world at this time. And we see the development of scholar officials. So O'Reilly says the new class of scholar official contributed to the Song period philosophy of government, which stressed the ideals of efficiency and civility, the belief that a well-run society reflected the higher and unchanging principles of moral order. This concept, you can see, probably goes in line with Confucianism, so it fits that idea. But it's also something that's very modern or contemporary. I see a lot of modern day liberals who kind of believe in this idea of efficiency and civility. And I think you'll see that during this time, there is a lot of those kind of modern ideas. So there develops a commercial market for art. So that makes a lot of sense if the nobility is losing power and the merchant class is going upwards. So because a lot of these people are kind of new rich or aren't really interested in, they don't really have a connection to the traditions of nobility, there's a lot of non-court themes. So some of the ideas, and again, you might recognize this as something modern, or if you're a resident of the United States, something that's common in the United States, this idea of a rugged individual. We start to see little color in the pieces. And there's this celebration of nature, that nature is an unchanging moral order. Again, kind of in line with Confucianism, but also in line with the types of ideas that you would see, for instance, in 19th century American Romanticism. So many artists, they kind of try to follow this ideal in a Thoreau type way, speaking of American Romanists. So some artists move to the mountains. And during this time is published by Jing Hao, The Notes on the Art of the Brush. And I think you may recognize some of the things that Jing Hao says in that. So this is a comparison contrast. We did this on, I usually do this in class. So you can kind of look at it yourself and see what the changes are. Obviously, there's a lot of changes. So pause it and kind of like take a look and try to think about what has changed from the style that developed in the Tang Dynasty to the style that develops in the Song Dynasty, and then move on. So Fan Quan and his Travelers Amid Mountains and Streams is the painting we were looking at in the previous slide. And he lived according to that ideal. He was a hermit. He lived in the mountains, and he was inspired by Huangshan Mountain. Um, so it actually looks like this. It's pretty interesting. I'll show you a picture in a second. So he developed the Kun wrinkle or raindrop brushstroke. Well, he probably didn't develop it, but he used it in these paintings. So how it would work was a little bit different than what we've seen with the more linear styles previously. There'd be an inside contour lines to shade, and then you add texture and three-dimensionality. And you do this with relatively quick techniques. There would be 25 different strokes. And here, like nowadays, people would, to make these textures, would use sponges. They would use like a bigger brush on this and kind of press it against to get these complex textures, and then press a little harder on the brush to get it spread apart to make these happy little trees. So if you recognize the idea of using these kind of like brushstroke tricks, that's exactly what Bob Ross used in his paintings and in the art of painting. So when you take a look at this one, at first you may not see that there's travelers. But if you take a very close look, and you can even pause it and try to take a close look, I think you'll be able to find them. They're right there. Of course, I'll bring you in closer. So that's Huangshan Mountain. These kind of mountains are kind of similar to the types of mountains that they have in some parts of Wyoming and Montana, Idaho. They're these granite kind of towers, and they have trees on them. So when we get in closer, we can see some of the travelers. They have their horses or mules pulling their stuff, and you can kind of see the streams amongst them. And even closer, and we can see our travelers. So the people are really small in these pictures, and nature is huge. And that goes along with the spirit of the age. And also, again, if this sort of idea pops up later in 19th century American Romanticism. So you can see these textures, which would be very complex to make if you thought about making them linearly, but using these special brushstroke techniques, which the artist will learn, it enables them to do these sorts of things much more quickly and get these complex textures. So Chan or Zen Buddhism, it's the same thing. It's just a different way, just a translation into Japanese when you say Zen. So some of the concepts you'll recognize from Taoism and from Buddhism that we talked about before. So one of the ideas is oneness with nature, meditation, which is the Zazen position in Japanese. And there develops a belief during this time of what's called instant enlightenment. We're actually going to see that as a subject in some of the paintings. And some people believe that if you sit in the Zazen position properly, which is sitting cross-legged on the floor with your back straight, as if you're holding up the ceiling, that you can reach enlightenment. There's also a belief that you can reach enlightenment by doing everyday things and truly experiencing them that as they are. So being fully within the experience that you're having. So we're going to see like the most mundane actions of people being enlightened. So then there's a couple of other qualities that might seem contradictory at first, but remember the yin and yang. Things that are opposites are kind of necessary to go together. So one is decisive action, and that makes its way into the art. A lot of the art we're going to see is going to develop. It's going to be done very quickly using calligraphic type strokes. The other thing is mindfulness. And one way to think of mindfulness is, again, to be truly in the moment. Sometimes in popular culture, they'll say you're having a Zen moment. What they're talking about is mindfulness. You're truly in that exact time, in that exact place, and nowhere else. So from this can come inspiration. So the idea that you could be thinking of something else, and then all of a sudden you're in the moment and you have an inspiration, you can take that in that time and make art out of it, poetry, whatever. So this art is very personal. There still is that art education where you try to learn to do what people had done before you, but you develop something that is very personal. And even to the point where it's personal for you at a particular time, but not necessarily at another time. So one of the ways to get to these states where it's kind of beyond rationality or deliberation is koans. So these are stories that are seeming contradictions. And the idea is to bring you into the moment and beyond rational thought. So there's a lot of these kind of koan ideas that have made their way in the popular culture. One is if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? So you can kind of like try to answer that yourself. And there isn't right answers to these koans. They are things that, since they're taking you beyond rationality and they're meant to kind of encourage mindfulness and bring you into the moment, the answer, and I'm putting up the air quotes, for a koan could be one answer one time and another answer another time. The other sound, which popular culture koan that I'm fond of doing, is what is this the sound of one hand clapping, and then a student will often put their hand up and bend their fingers down and make a clapping noise like that, and then I pointed out right away that they stole that from Bart Simpson, and that's, as a result, it's not the right answer because they weren't in the moment. So that's an important kind of idea with koans, is that sometimes the answers don't make sense, sometimes they do, but either way, it can only come from that one person and from that moment. Some other ones that are kind of more complicated, that there's a lot of them out there. I give a link here, but I'll give you some that I found out from a Zen philosophy professor who studied Zen in Vietnam when he was in the after the serving in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. He actually went back and stayed in a monastery there. So he knows some koans that you probably haven't heard other places. So one is about a monk. And the monks in these stories, they always end up being great leaders later on. But right now, this monk is just on the lower totem pole, and he has to do the work that someone on the lower totem pole has to do. So the abbot of the monastery, or the person that deals with the finances, gives him some money and sends him to the next town to pick up a bag of rice. So he gets his cloak together, really simple, his bowl and his chopsticks, and he brings the money, and that's it. And he starts traveling. On the way there, he notices, because he's mindful, that there are some people following him, but he doesn't let it go. He doesn't pay attention to it too much. He's mindful on what he's doing. So when he gets to the town, he purchases some rice, and he kind of slings the bag over his shoulder, takes his change back, and heads back. But he notices that he's being followed again. And he's not worried about it because, again, he's being mindful of what he's doing. He realizes he won't be able to make it back to the monastery before it gets dark, so he decides to set up camp. He puts down his bowl and his chopsticks and a bag of rice, and sets the money aside and goes to sleep. So he wakes up in the middle of the night, and he notices that everything is gone. They took his bag of rice. They took the money, of course. They even took his simple little bowl and his simple little chopsticks. So in this part of the story, you switch to the point of view of the robbers. So the robbers are getting away. They got some rice. They got some money. They got a bowl and chopsticks for some reason. And they hear something behind them, like a yelling. So they look behind them and they notice really far away, there's this guy who is totally naked and he's swinging a cloth above himself and he's saying, "You forgot something." So you can think about that one. And I'll give you one more, but I have to explain the idea of emptiness from Buddhism. So imagine, like, if you're sitting here listening to this and you have some water. I have some water in one of those bottles. So the water can only exist if the bottle is there to contain it. The bottle can only exist because of the table that you're sitting out on. The table can only exist because of the floor of your apartment or house. Your house can only exist because of the foundations that it's built on. The foundations can only exist because of the rock and the ground that's around your house or apartment. The rock and the ground can only exist because of the plate that it's sitting on, the geological plate. That geological plate can only exist if it's sitting on the earth. The earth can only exist if it's part of the solar system with the sun and collating out of the gas and dust of the formation of the solar system. The solar system can only exist because of the galaxy. The galaxy can only exist because of the galaxy clusters. The galaxy clusters can only exist because of the galaxy superclusters. The superclusters can only exist because of the visible universe, and the visible universe can only exist because of the rest of the universe we can't see. And the rest of the universe we can't see can only exist because of it just never ends. There's nowhere to go. So that's the idea of emptiness in Buddhism, that everything depends on everything else in the real world, what is called Maya. And we'll talk about that later on when we get to India. And that the spiritual world is real. Because everything in Maya, the physical world, is empty, you can't ever look at something, the end of what it depends on. It's not real. So a common saying is form, meaning stuff, is empty. And that's a way to describe the concept of emptiness. So back to the koan, now that you understand that, maybe. So there is an abbot of a monastery, and he has all of his students around, and he's fond of asking them questions. But, sometimes he can be kind of cruel. He holds a staff at the ready, just in case he doesn't like the answers to the questions. So he asks one of the novices, "What is form?" And the novice says, without pausing, "Form is emptiness." Immediately, the abbot swings up his staff and hits the novice in the face, breaking his nose, and a big blood fountain comes out of his nose. And he says, "Was that empty?" So that's often the way that these koans go. They kind of take what you thought you knew and they put it in a different direction. So if any of that made sense to you, you should probably try again because it probably shouldn't make sense yet. So how this applies to Chan painting is we see scenes of nature like we saw with Fan Quan. There's often moments of enlightenment. And again, those can be moments of the most mundane things. If a person is being mindful, then they will know about it. So koans is another way. And again, to take you out of rationality and to bring you into the moment. And often these pictures are painted quickly and decisively. And because of, being mindful, they have a very individual character. They can only be made by that person in that moment. So we see calligraphy strokes develop in this style. So this is Ma Yuan, and he's one of those Wen Ren or literati. They work for passion, not for money, so they're not court painters. They're talking about sympathetic responsiveness to qi. And they use a style that's relatively inexpensive because this one's on silk, but they develop a lot of them on paper. This style is called shimo and ink painting. And it's something that you can do many, many versions of one of these paintings and do it on your salary of a civil servant. So during this time, there develops a conflict. We have the Wen Ren, who are often civil servants. They make enough money to live, and they only make art for sympathetic responsiveness to qi. And in a way, they see that as more true art. And then the academic painters are making things for elites, and they're making things in old styles and not moving forward. Perhaps they're not being mindful when they make stuff, and they're doing it for money. And oftentimes the Wen Ren will be kind of snobby towards the academic painters. They'll look at them as sellouts. So the Wen Ren, I guess, consider themselves somewhat punk rock. So Ma Yuan is one of these scholar officials, but eventually he became so famous and well known for his work that he worked for the court. So other literati are like, "You sellout," and they disparage him, but all others respect him. He becomes a basis for the Japanese literati that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So you can kind of see with these pieces that in a kind of like shallow way, they represent like the Pier 1 imports or Banana Republic version of Chinese art, or even IKEA that you would see. But that's just because this style probably to Westerners looks, and I put up the air quotes, exotic. Westerners like to other people. But the style is very calligraphic, and you can see that there is some kind of like ink techniques that we had seen, like washes and such. But if you look at the bamboo, they're made with just a few strokes, like you would with calligraphy, and they're done quickly and quite elegantly. So if you get a little closer, you can see, you can actually trace the individual strokes. So remember in art education, it's T and Fa. Style and methods. So if you were trying to learn how to do this, you would try to do the strokes in the exact same way before you would practice the strokes in your own way and be able to do it in your own way. So this calligraphic style does a couple of things. It's interesting, but it also allows people to make work more quickly. So again, they can be mindful. The idea of deliberation is something that's not very important, even if the medium requires deliberation before the work. The actual execution of the work doesn't have deliberation. So you can see how the signatures and the poetry that are attached to these is very expressive, almost unreadable sometimes. But again, that's to show your individual personality and your individuality in the moment of art can only go through you at a particular time, and that's what they're trying to communicate here. So this style of painting that Ma Yuan develops, often called the lyrical mode in Japan as well. But other people looked at it in a different way later on. So a 16th century critic, and this is during the Ming Dynasty, and I'll talk about why they would say this, says, "What have I to do with the taillands of mountains and truncated streams, the product of ignoble refugees?" And sometimes he's talking about foreigners like Manchurians and such. So that's one kind of idea behind his statement. But it's also in the Ming Dynasty, which we'll talk about later on, these times and the development of this art in this very kind of like rural wilderness focus and inward focus is seen as a weakness. And when the country runs this way, it made it susceptible to invasion. And we'll see how the Yuan Dynasty is an invasion by the people that live in the steppes, now called Mongolians. So I'm not saying this stuff is true. I'm saying that's kind of where this statement of the 16th century critic is coming from. So this one is interesting. When I have it in class, I often ask people to try to identify what's in the top left corner of the painting, like what is here? And you can see how a couple of the figures are looking at it. It's called Watching the Deer by a Pine Shaded Stream. And you can find the deer here, but is that what they're watching? So it's kind of useful to kind of think about what this is. And that's part of the kind of like Zen Buddhist ideas that are in these paintings. It's asked the viewer to participate in a particular moment. So if you want, you could pause and kind of write down some things and figure out what you're seeing in that empty space. This style it develops is eventually known as the Ma Xia style. So Xia Gui, who is active around the same time. And this style really influenced the people who are more thinking of themselves as Chan Buddhists. So when you get in really close, you can see, again, it looks like relatively naturalistic, but it's done very quickly. You can see how these lines, this is just one line that's continuing here. That kind of reminds me of cartoonists. If you see them, ones that have been doing strips for a long time, they can execute a figure in just seconds. And that's because it's coming from practice. It's almost more like the way that people play musical instruments, where you practice and practice so you can play things that are very fast and precise, that almost seem impossible in a way. So that's kind of where the artists are coming through with this as well. Some pieces would be done very decisively and quickly. So eventually, everything comes together into this style that Sherman Lee calls the spontaneous mode. And I think that's a really good description because this is done even more quickly. The picture you're looking at, Huaneng, the six-chan patriarch chopping bamboo at the moment of enlightenment, probably could be executed in about the time that it took for Huineng to chop the bamboo. So perhaps just a few minutes. And an artist may do a subject like this, hundreds or even thousands of times, and then find one that was just right. So that contradiction between a lifelong practice but instant enlightenment also makes its way into how the art is created. So O'Reilly says it's the work of a master so well tuned to his subject materials that matters of technique it becomes second nature, and his hand and brush can respond directly to his chi in a lifetime of experiences. And I can relate that again to music performance. I play drums, and whenever I played with people where you're improvising, you have a lot of things that you might pull out while you're playing, but you're not deliberating on them, thinking, oh, I'm going to do this next, I'm going to do that. Instead, the best way is to be exactly in the moment. And you can have experience where the relationship between you, the players, and the audience kind of comes very easily. So this style heavily influenced painting in Japan. And again, we can see even more quickly than we saw with Ma Yuan, just a few strokes, but elegant, and you still have a bit of naturalism. These contours are very graceful. So when you get in close, it's kind of amazing, but like something like this, again, could be executed in mere seconds. But it gives us enough visual information to really feel what's going on and see how mindful he is. He's completely in this moment. He's not aware of us looking at him in any way he can't be. Again, you can almost count the strokes. You can see where the strokes started and where they end. And it's amazing that you can have so few lines and still be able to create something that we can recognize. So this economy of line, it continues throughout Chinese history we're going to look at, but it develops during this time period. So this one, I often show it in class, and we try to figure out what's up with this. It's Mu Chi, and it's called Six Persimmons. And I took an Asian art class in undergrad where the teacher said that this was her favorite work of art in the entire class, which I thought was interesting because she had done her PhD dissertation on the first emperor of China's tomb, a completely different type of work, obviously. So the idea with some of these works is that in theory, or yeah, I guess you could say in theory, you can't rationally look at a piece like this and determine why people are so fond of it and why it's been so influential. So in that way, it compares to koans. If you try to approach it in a way that uses language that you might have read other art historians or other people, art critics that look at art, then you'll fail to fully experience it for you yourself as a viewer to be mindful. But I think it can be useful to try to figure out why this piece is so interesting. So you might want to pause it and think about, why is this interesting? Whereas the 6 persimmons photograph isn't very interesting to most people. So if you can determine that, you can really get something going out of it. So Muqi is known as Fa Chang in China. O'Reilly says a couple of interesting things. The dark diagonal brushstrokes of the stems also make the persimmons look part fruit, part Chinese characters. I think we can see that for sure right here. One historian has called it passion congealed into a stupendous calm. A lot of flowery language there, but again, I think you can look at this piece and look at some of the formal things that are happening and perhaps get why people are so influenced by this or so affected by this particular piece. So we're breaking the rules. We're trying to figure rational ways why this supposedly irrational works. So this seems like a strange transition because we're talking about ceramics. We're talking about ceramics made with very high heat. So there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of work that goes into making ceramics. And you might not think of it as matching, making ink on paper where you can just pull one out and do it immediately. So to kind of account for that, these guanware vases, they have moments where they are not quite controllable. So like the painting that we see develop during this time, it's simplified compared to the Tang Dynasty where you had like colorful ones, colorful slips to make interesting patterns and pictures. And it's more monochromatic. These are called guanware, and I put the quotes up in classic Chinese ceramics because that's really a Western view. This would be a useful time to mention Orientalism, which is a fascinating book and theory developed by Edward Said, a Palestinian American. And he talks about how Westerners often looked at other cultures as being simplistic or circular or something along those ideas. And he saw this as justifications for imperialism. The West saw themselves as progressive, and everybody else as this mysterious or exotic other, but also as continually moving in circles instead of progressing forward. So this kind of like almost fetish with simplicity when it comes to Asian art, it's even more so with Japanese art, leads to perhaps this idea of a classic Chinese ceramic. A lot of the art we've looked at has been very detailed, maybe even over-decorated. So when Westerners look at something like this and they say that the simpler ones are classic, oftentimes that's the way to kind of like exoticize or kind of infantilize Chinese culture. So this is porcelain, and if you know anything about ceramics, you know that porcelain is pretty difficult. It takes some technology. It takes a lot of high heat. It's not quite glass, but close. So the guanware simulate the appearance of jades, and their lustrous matte surfaces appeal to a sense of touch, which is a shame because whenever you see these in person, you want to touch them, but in museums, they don't let you do that. But it definitely has like a kind of visceral effect that goes along with Chan Buddhism that we've been talking about. So accidental cracking, speaking of Chan Buddhism, like the painters where they have these accidental moments that create something interesting, are considered to be very auspicious. And like what we were talking about with Muqi, it's not supposed to be something that can be rationally explained. Sometimes you'll have one cracking away and you'll think, no. Other times you'll think, yes. And supposedly it's not supposed to be any more rational than that. In this case, I can kind of agree with it because I'm not sure what makes it appealing, but some are more appealing to others. So like the Chan, it's rational, as in there's a lot of rational engineering that has to go into making porcelains, but non-rational as in why was this particular cracked ceramic look better than the others? Same thing with this one. Part of the appeal might be these like the randomness but evenness of these types of patterns. I think people find like really dry areas with cracked earth like this appealing for similar reasons. So the Yuan Dynasty is quite different than the other dynasties that we looked at before, in that it's a foreign dynasty um, run by Temujin in China, who in the West is known as Genghis Khan. And he lives from about the end of the 12th into the 13th century. And if you're thinking of Genghis Khan and how he's considered in the West as this almost like brutal and animalistic even leader, I think that's quite inaccurate. He was like brutal for sure. The Mongol Empire ended up spanning from China all the way to modern day Hungary in Europe. So it was the largest world empire that ever existed at that time. It probably wasn't exceeded until the British Empire later on, which will come up when we talk about 19th century China. And his grandson, Kublai Khan, rules China. And he does so as a Chinese ruler, basically. So this is kind of what I was talking about in the first lecture about Sinicizing people next to them. In other words, making them like Chinese. So the culture and the art of China is so compelling that even when they are conquered by foreigners, their culture conquers the foreigners themselves. So Kublai Khan, they were Tibetan Buddhists. That's a type of esoteric Buddhism. We'll talk about that when we get to Tibet. And not surprisingly, the civil service exams are abolished. The Khanate wants to focus power in themselves, so they don't want to have local Chinese running things in a big bureaucracy that they can't control. Foreign officials turn to art and writing. And there's this kind of impression that in later Chinese history that this time happened because too many educated people were concerned with frivolous things. So, and again, I'm not stating the truth of that. I don't believe that's so. But it's the way that Chinese history is organized. It'll help us to understand what some of the art is being done after this period. So the Khanate sets up a capital in Beijing, which is the modern day capital of China. And the South continues some Chinese traditions. So Jiao Meng Fu and its bamboo rocks and lonely orchids. This is a rolled out version of it. And some of it is poetry that went with it, but other ones are commentary on it. So it's kind of interesting. Art critics or owners would attach a sheet to it to talk about things like that. And O'Reilly says, sweeping away the veils of mist, they create a solid, hard-edged tradition of ink painting that seems to express the austerity of this period of foreign occupation. In some ways, I think O'Reilly is right in that we do have harder lines. But in another way, I think he's simplifying the era too much. I think we're going to see a lot of work that continues the style that we saw develop from Ma Yuan, a lot of calligraphic type of writing and poetry and Zen ideas in some of these paintings. And I'm going to be able to express some other ideas that are very important to Zen as we go on. So Jiao Mingfu is the husband of Guan Daosheng, and she is a great poet who at the time was actually more well-known than her husband. So he's using paper instead of silk. And again, that comes from, it's easier to do these types of works on paper because you don't have to worry about messing it up. But also there isn't as much elite patronage. So if you don't have rich people paying for things, if you're an artist, even at that time, you can't afford silk. So you can see how when they're rolled up, they can have like some interesting decorations and these archaic characters on the outside. So when you get into the painting part of it, it's very poetic and it expresses an idea that is, by some modern Zen scholars, considered to be one of the most important ideas in Zen Buddhism. So I'll kind of like read some of this stuff and explain. So on seeing the bamboo rocks and lonely orchids by the Duke from Wuxing, one feels one is suddenly cleansed of lowly and narrow-minded sentiments. His brush moves so freely at his will, vertically and horizontally, through meeting no resistance. It comes so naturally with a disarming flare of naivete and earnestness, as though coming directly from the calligraphers of the two Wangs. And then goes on to talk about how important it is. So this idea of naivete comes from the idea that as people are young, when they're children, before they can talk, and certainly before they can read, they experience things more directly. And that's because they haven't read things or put words onto things that can kind of put yourself between you and the experience. Like in popular culture, this is often called the moon. The word moon isn't the moon, it's just a finger pointing at the moon. And then as you progress and get closer to enlightenment, you can get back to that full experience, that mindfulness that Shiloh would have, but it's in a different experience because of all the things that have happened in your life so far. So this will come up again later on, and I'll kind of explain more about it as we do. So bamboo, it's like brush technique, willowy. They stand up in the strong wind. So this contradiction of the movement of bamboo, but the strength of bamboo at the same time. It's very strong and solid, and you can use it to build things that last a long time, but it grows very fast. So these types of contradictions are very appealing to the artists philosophically at this time. But, you know, the Mongol dynasty, you got to sell some stuff to them if you want to make some money. So you see some of these animal paintings, which appeal to them. So the Mongols were originally herders. So these types of things, of course, they would make sense to them. It's a sheep and a goat. I think this one's the sheep and this one's the goat. I don't know. I'm not a zoologist. But, you know, I think this one is rather cute. And you see that sort of thing going on. So it's kind of interesting, like the previous piece is more in line with the Chinese traditions we had seen, whereas this one isn't. And it's rather simplistic. You might find it appealing. But you can see that it has many, many owners with all of these stamps. So through time, this came to be associated with some power. So Wang Yuan, again, O'Reilly's saying this idea that the pieces are more precise and less mysterious as a song. In this case, yes. And again, we're seeing this kind of like style that becomes popular in the West as what Chinese painting is. Obviously, there's many different ways that Chinese painting can be. So many of them react against the softness of the Southern Song painting as a manifestation of the highly refined aesthetics and passivity of the leaders who allowed successive foreign invasions to take place. So whether or not this art is a reaction to the softness, I don't know if I can say that, but O'Reilly's correct in that later people defined this art as a movement towards something that's more solid and more strong, kind of like the 16th century critic that we saw commenting on Ma Yuan's painting earlier. So when you get in close, there is some of the techniques that we've seen before, washes and brush techniques, but a certain amount of solidity and naturalism that's going on that was a little bit missing from previous periods. So very precise brushwork, probably a bit more deliberate, but we can see the calligraphic styles in the bamboo over here. So the Ming Dynasty is the biggest one so far. They end up taking over Manchuria. The capital is still located in Beijing. And they drive out the Mongols in 1368. We'll talk about the Mongols again when we get to Japan, because that'll also have a pretty big effect. So it's a native Chinese dynasty, and they follow what's known as Neo-Confucianism. And when we talk about the Qing dynasty later on, you can kind of look at that as Neo-Confucianism as well. Like most things described as Neo, There's not really anything particularly new about it. It's kind of continuing some of the ideas that we saw in the Song Dynasty and bringing some of those ideas back and modernizing them a bit. So Ming means brilliant. That tells you right away how this is considered in Chinese history. Hongwu Emperor purges Mongol influence, and he uses the invasion and conquering of China as an excuse to institute more autocratic rule. So this might be the neo part in Confucianism. We're not going to quite get to legalism, but there certainly is a view amongst the Chinese elite that authoritarianism is like an acceptable way to bring together the empire. So what's kind of ironic is that there's probably less freedom for artists than in the Yuan. So along with this autocracy, there's an idea that the emperor wants to control imagery, and not just the emperor himself, but the institution of the imperial court. And that way they can kind of ensure that they remain in control and won't get taken over by foreigners. So probably the most famous style and medium that developed during this time were these vases that were made out of white porcelain with these blue slips. So they're made in what's called the Jingdezhen kilns. And a lot of these pieces were exported in massive amounts. The clay is high in kaolin, so you can get that beautiful, very, very white color. Kaolin is also used in ancient Egypt. And then the blue glaze, which kind of you probably already recognize and associate with the Ming Dynasty, is discovered by the Mongols in Kashan, which is in Persia. We're going to talk about Kashan a little bit later on when we get to South Asia. And it's just cobalt oxide. And this chemical is still used for blue colors. My father was a glass chemist, and he used it for blue glass that he developed for Mercedes. So it's painted, it's covered with the white glaze and fired, and you get this incredible kind of porcelain. Supposedly, because these are so well known and valued, there's a lot of fakes made of these. And supposedly, people can tap on them and hear the ringing sound of the porcelain. Porcelain tends to have a nice ring to it because of the way that the molecules kind of align up in a way like metal or glass. And if you hear that sound, you can tell if it's real. I'm extremely skeptical of such things, but I think in modern times, there's other ways to test it to be sure that it is authentic and from the time period. This particular one, though, would not have been exported around the world because it has a dragon on it. And ones that were made with dragon images were associated with the emperor, so just made for the imperial court or for diplomatic gifts they would give to others, especially towards the end of this period. So dragon is associated with the rain and the emperor. We're still, even though it's a very complex society and very urban, lots of complex institutions, we're still talking about an agricultural society. And back then you could be done in by droughts. So by the emperor associating himself with dragons, the rain, it shows that he's the thing that makes the rains come and feeds everyone. That's one of the most important things that an autocratic ruler can do, convince the people that they need him. So this piece is extremely complex, although if you go to an Asian market nowadays, you might see something like this in plastic or wood that's mass produced. But these ones are very, very elite. So they're carved red lacquer. Lacquer, as we learned from that video earlier in the class, is very expensive. And the way that a piece like this would be made is that it have lacquer that dries in different colors and layers. And then it would take, you'd have to take like weeks for the lacquer to dry in between the layers. And then after that was all done, and this would take months of time, it would be carved in to the layers. And by how deep you carve, it would reveal the different colors, so the red and the blue color. So at that point, after all of the work, sometimes months of work that went into it, you could mess it up fairly easily. So these pieces, these carved red lacquers, are very, very elite pieces. And you can see with this one, we have the dragon in the middle, and then the longevity. There's this idea the emperor lives forever. And the same sort of thing where we have movement with the dragons and with the clouds, and then solidity with the mountains. When you get in close again, just think about how maddening it would be to carve in this, and think about how easily you could screw it up. So this last one, and these are some of my favorite pieces. Over at the Detroit Institute of Art, they have a really great piece of this that's similar to this one, made out of ivory. So carving ivory is its own medium, but in some ways it can be kind of like wood. There can be grains that come out in the ivory, and if the artist carves contours to follow those grains, it can enhance the effect. But we're also seeing something that's a little bit different than you would see in a lot of Western work at this time, and that it's really in a moment. If you look at that facial expression, it's not the type of facial expression you would see in other forms of art. It's very, sometimes people describe it as like kind of like knowing, or even being snobby, looking down at people, or perhaps being bemused. But it's a very particular human expression, and it's in a particular moment. But again, these like opposites and contradictions. It's the god of longevity, and he's with a deer. That's a symbol of longevity. So both in the moment and forever, we're seeing here. So his head represents a pumpkin gourd, which contains the water of life. So he's this kind of like spiritual figure that creates external life, so internal life. So long beard and a big old head. When you get in close, you can again see it. This kind of reminds me of some of the expressions that my Zen philosophy professor would make. You would ask him a question, and you could tell that he was interested in the question if he made this expression. So when you get in close again, you can see almost like the grain of what happens with ivory being followed. And this amber color that it fades into would be expected, and it would work with the work over time. So with this Wenjing Ming, we're talking about the Wu school. And the Wu school is easy to pick out because they have these trees, but they also represent something else. And this kind of like goes towards the Buddhist ideas of emptiness. Because the real world, Maya, is empty, things in the real world can be other things, and there's literally no difference. So by looking at a tree and then seeing a dragon, it's not that like the tree looks like a dragon. The tree is a dragon. So that's kind of the concept that we have here. It's a little bit easier to see in this painting. If you want to pause it and kind of pick out the qualities that you see that are dragon-like, I think it'll come out of it. So take a pause, maybe write some of those things down, and you can get an idea of what these pieces are like. So the poetry on this is constantly its form is changing. Chances are it never could be caught. Its dragon whiskers bristle like lances, rank after rank. So this combination of power, flexibility, speed, suppleness is something that we see in these paintings. When you get in close, you can see multiple brush techniques coming through. So the types of techniques that we've been seeing develop for years. So the painting and the calligraphy are inseparable. This is one work, and you can't take one away from the other. So during this time, we really see that painting kind of rises in comparison to calligraphy, which is still considered to be a very great art. So this one gets back to the concept I was talking about earlier, about a finger pointing at the moon, but more precisely. So we have the bamboo, and the poem on it says, "In the empty studio, sitting deep in deep loneliness, like cool sound sending pure beauty, or pennant swinging in the wind, or a solitary chin suggested running water. Where is that sound from? The green poles in the courtyard, clear and light like an echo. The sound and ears are in tune. The sound of bamboo, now very beautiful. My ears are also clear. Who says the sound is in the bamboo? To know it depends on oneself. A noble person is like a tall bamboo. A thin bamboo is like a noble man. When a sound enters, the mind responds. Only one thing but artificially separated. A bystander searching for the sound, but the sound can only be found in silence. Otherwise, I am still I, bamboo is still bamboo. Even if I live with bamboo every day, still the music will be 1,000 miles away. Look at the sound's most primeval source. Did it enter a zither or a lute? So what this is explaining is the concept of the journey for the Zen Buddhist through life. When we start out life as babies, we're basically just sponges. We're fully mindful of everything because we don't have anything interfering with our mindful experiences. We don't see a disconnection between us and the things that are around us. And what's interesting about this is that this somewhat is in line with the way that modern developmental scientists look at human babies. They often say that babies can't really tell the difference between themselves and their mothers, and they can't really tell the difference between things that are inside of them and things that are outside of them. So they don't have ideas of object permanence. That's why they think peekaboo is so hilarious. But as you start to talk and as you start to read, there's a separation between you and the things that are out there. So I am still I, bamboo is still bamboo. But over time, to become enlightened, it's to realize that all of these things are one in some ways. And when now that phrase, otherwise I am still I, bamboo is still bamboo, still the music will be 1,000 miles away. What's the sound's most primeval source? It's talking about the connection between us, our ego, as they would say, in Western psychology, and what's outside of us. And part of becoming enlightened is to have this become in tune and holistic when the relationship to things that are outside of you. So that's the journey. It's there is no I, then there is an I, and it's separated from everything else. And then we're back to a holistic way of looking at things. There is an I, there is that thing, but we're all together as one. So the journey of the Zen Buddhist in painting. And when we get in close, we can see done very quickly. Bamboo is because it makes sounds, and also because of the contradictions with bamboo, it makes it, a perfect subject for these types of ideas. A noble person is like a tall bamboo. A thin bamboo is like a noble man, both strong and flexible and standing above everything. So this last one, I think, is an example of something that is pretty common in Chinese culture. And some Chinese American friends of mine used to talk about this particular way of going about things, which is very interesting. So it's definitely made its way over to Chinese Americans. And there's a convenient word that's developed over the past couple of decades to explain what this is. What it is a humble brag. So I think you can read that in this particular poem. It says, from the throne, this exquisite silk was bestowed on me as I expressed my gratitude to His Majesty by the Goldwater Bridge. The heavenly silk is embroidered with 5 colors. Resplendent it is, draping of my arm with designs of twin dragons. Having received such a gift, I bowed in shame over my lack of achievements. Humbly I returned to my rank to observe the grand ceremony. I wish His Majesty shall live on for a myriad of years, and the sun will always shine upon his trailing robe. So in this part, and he literally uses the word humble. He sounds pretty humble. He is. He's like bowing to the greatness of the emperor. But at the same time, he's also bragging because he's saying, yes, the emperor bestowed this incredibly expensive and exquisite silk on me. And that makes me something a little bit special. So the humble brag, it fits perfectly in with some of the kind of social rules that are common in Confucianism.